She didn't know that the man she was about to beg for sanctuary was the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories. She didn't know that his estate had been warded against anyone finding it, unless he willed it so. And she certainly didn't know that the moment she stumbled through his iron gates, bloody and desperate in the pre-dawn darkness, she had just found her fated mate. All she knew was that she couldn't run another step. Her bare feet were torn and bleeding from 3 days of flight through the mountain forests. The borrowed dress, stolen from a clothesline in her desperation, hung in tatters around her bruised frame. Every breath felt like fire in her chest, and the taste of copper filled her mouth from where her lip had split when she'd fallen face first into a creek bed hours earlier. The massive stone house loomed before her like something from a dream, all Gothic spires and warm golden light spilling from tall windows. It was the kind of place where people like her weren't supposed to exist, let alone collapse on the front steps like a broken bird. But she was out of choices. With the last of her strength, she dragged herself up the marble steps and raised her trembling fist to the heavy oak door. The sound of her knocking echoed through what must have been a grand foyer beyond, weak and pathetic against the solid wood. Footsteps approached, heavy, confident, male. Every instinct she had developed over the past 3 years screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't carry her another inch. The door swung open, and she found herself staring up at the most devastating man she had ever seen. He was tall, impossibly tall, with broad shoulders that filled the doorframe and eyes the colour of winter storms. His dark hair was slightly mussed as if he'd been running his hands through it, and he wore a simple black shirt that did nothing to hide the raw power that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a forge. When those storm-grey eyes fell on her, something in her chest pulled tight, not fear this time, but something else, something that felt impossibly like recognition. "Please," she whispered, the word barely audible through her swollen lip. "I need help." For a moment that stretched like eternity, he simply stared at her. His gaze travelled over her battered face, the finger-shaped bruises on her throat, the way she clutched the doorframe to keep from falling. Something dangerous flickered in those storm-coloured eyes, something that should have terrified her, but instead made her feel safer than she had in years. "God!" he breathed, and his voice was like warm honey poured over gravel. "What did they do to you?" Before she could answer, before she could even process that he was speaking to her like she was something precious instead of the broken thing she knew herself to be, her knees gave out entirely. She expected to hit cold marble. Instead, strong arms caught her, lifting her against a chest that was warm and solid and smelled impossibly like cedar and rain. The sensation of being held, truly held, not grabbed or restrained or hurt, was so foreign that tears she'd been holding back for days finally spilled over. "I've got you," he murmured against her hair, and the words settled into her bones like a promise. "You're safe now." He carried her through rooms that blurred together in her exhaustion, glimpses of polished wood and rich fabrics, and fireplaces that crackled with warmth. When he finally set her down, it was on the softest sofa she had ever felt, in a sitting room that looked like something out of a fairy tale. "Don't move," he said gently, and there was something in his voice that made it impossible to even think of disobeying. Not because she was afraid, though she should have been afraid of this stranger, but because every part of her wanted to do whatever would keep that careful tenderness in his expression. He disappeared for a few minutes, returning with a first aid kit and a glass of water that he pressed into her shaking hands. "Small sips," he instructed, settling beside her on the sofa with movements so careful she might have been made of spun glass. The water was cool and perfect, and she had to force herself not to gulp it down. When had she last had clean water? When had anyone spoken to her with such gentle authority, as if her well-being actually mattered? "My name is Marcus," he said, as he began cleaning the cuts on her hands with movements so gentle she barely felt the sting. "What's yours?" "Lily," she whispered, and realised it was the first time she'd said her real name aloud in months. "Lily." He repeated it like it was something precious, and warmth spread through her chest in a way that had nothing to do with the fireplace. That's a beautiful name. She almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Beautiful. When was the last time anyone had called anything about her beautiful? When she was covered in bruises and wearing a stolen dress and probably smelled like the forest floor? But when she looked up into his eyes, she saw no mockery there. No pity either, which was somehow worse than cruelty. Just a steady kindness that made her want to cry all over again. "You don't have to tell me what happened," he said as he wrapped her hands in soft gauze. "Not tonight, but you need medical attention and you need rest. Will you let me help you?" It was the fact that he asked, that he made it a choice instead of a demand, that undid her completely. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she admitted, and the words felt like admitting defeat and victory all at once. "Then stay." His fingers were impossibly gentle as they tilted her chin up, and she found herself drowning in those storm-grey eyes. "Stay as long as you need to, no questions, no conditions, just stay until you're ready to decide what comes next." Something golden and warm unfurled in her chest, and for the first time in 3 years, Lily felt like she might actually be safe. She didn't know that the man offering her sanctuary commanded the loyalty of every wolf pack in the Northern Territories. She didn't know that his gentleness was legendary among his people, but his fury was the stuff of nightmares for anyone foolish enough to threaten those under his protection. But she was beginning to suspect that Marcus was far more than he seemed, and for the first time since her world had shattered, that thought didn't terrify her. It gave her hope. The days that followed were a strange sort of peace. Lily woke each morning in a bedroom that belonged in a palace, with sheets softer than anything she'd ever imagined, and sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked endless gardens. For the first 3 mornings, she jolted awake expecting to find herself back in that cold, cramped room where every creak of the floorboards had meant danger. Instead, she found fresh clothes laid out on the chair beside her bed, simple things in her size that fit perfectly, and the scent of coffee drifting up from somewhere below. Marcus never asked how he knew her size. She never asked how he'd acquired women's clothing so quickly. Some questions felt safer left unasked. He had a way of moving through the house that spoke of absolute ownership, yet he never made her feel like an intruder in his space. When she appeared in the doorway of what she'd learned was his study, still uncertain and afraid of overstepping, he would look up from whatever papers covered his massive oak desk and smile in a way that made something warm bloom in her chest. "Good morning, Lily," he would say, and her name in his deep voice sounded like a prayer. "Did you sleep well?" The first few times she could only nod. Sleep had been a luxury she'd almost forgotten existed, but in this house, in his presence, she slept deeply and dreamlessly for the first time in years. She didn't tell him about the nightmares that had plagued her for so long, or how she'd trained herself to sleep light and wake at the slightest sound. She didn't need to. Somehow he seemed to understand. Their meals together became a ritual she began to crave. Marcus would appear in the kitchen each morning as she tentatively explored the house, rolling up the sleeves of whatever expensive shirt he wore and pulling ingredients from cabinets that seemed impossibly well stocked. He cooked like a man who had learned the skill out of necessity rather than pleasure, but his hands were sure and steady as they worked. "I sent the staff away," he explained one morning when she asked about the empty house. "Thought you might be more comfortable without strangers around while you recover." The casual way he said it, as if dismissing an entire household staff was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, made her wonder again exactly who Marcus was. But when he set a plate of perfectly prepared eggs and bacon in front of her with the same gentle care he'd shown that first night, the questions faded. Food had been scarce for so long that she had to force herself to eat slowly, to savour instead of wolfing down everything placed before her. Marcus seemed to sense this too, always making sure her plate was full while never commenting on how eagerly she ate, or how she sometimes caught herself hoarding small portions of bread in her pockets out of old habit. "Tell me about the gardens," she said one afternoon as they sat at the small table in his breakfast nook. Through the window she could see paths winding between flowers she didn't recognize and trees that looked older than time itself. Something shifted in his expression, a softness she was beginning to recognize. "My mother planted them," he said. "She believed that beauty should surround the people you love, even when, especially when, the world outside might be harsh." There was something in his voice that spoke of loss, of a grief he carried with the same quiet strength he seemed to approach everything else. Lily found herself leaning forward, drawn by the vulnerability she heard beneath his controlled words. "She sounds wonderful," she said softly. She was. His storm-grey eyes met hers across the table. "She would have loved you." The words hit her like a physical blow, not because they hurt, but because they were so impossibly kind. When had anyone ever suggested that she might be worthy of love from someone's mother? When had anyone looked at her broken, damaged self and seen something that could be loved at all? Marcus seemed to realize the impact of his words, because his expression gentled further. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you." "You didn't," she managed, and realized it was true. He hadn't upset her. He'd given her something she'd thought was lost forever. Hope. It's been a long time since anyone said anything like that to me." "Then they were fools," he said with such quiet conviction that she almost believed him. That afternoon he walked her through the gardens his mother had created. The paths were perfectly maintained, and every plant seemed to thrive under what she was beginning to suspect was his personal attention. When she commented on a particularly stunning display of roses, he cut several with a small knife he produced from his pocket and handed them to her with the same careful formality he might have shown a queen. "Marcus," she said, as they paused beside a fountain where water danced in the late afternoon sunlight. "What do you do? I mean, this place, the way you—" She gestured helplessly at the manicured perfection surrounding them. He was quiet for a long moment, and she thought he might not answer. When he did, his words were carefully chosen. "I handle problems for people who can't handle them themselves. I make sure that those who would hurt the innocent face consequences for their actions." Something in his tone made her shiver, though not with fear. There was steel beneath the gentleness, a promise of protection that was also a warning to anyone who might threaten what was his. The way he said it, the absolute certainty in his voice, made her think of powerful men she'd heard whispers about. Men who commanded respect through more than just wealth. But when he turned to her, his expression was nothing but gentle concern. "Are you cold? We should go inside." She wasn't cold. If anything, standing close to him in the dappled sunlight made her feel warmer than she had in years. There was something about his presence that seemed to chase away the chill that had lived in her bones since the day her world had shattered. That evening, as they sat in his study with the fireplace crackling and rain pattering against the windows, Lily found herself speaking about things she'd kept locked inside for months. "I had a sister once," she said quietly, her fingers wrapped around a cup of tea that tasted like heaven and peace. "Emma. She was 2 years younger, and she used to say I was the brave one." She laughed, but there was no humour in it. "If she could see me now—" "She would see exactly what I see," Marcus said from his chair across from her. He'd been reading something that looked official and important, but his attention was entirely focused on her now. Someone who survived things that would have broken most people. Someone strong enough to keep going when everything told her to give up. "I ran," she whispered. "When things got bad, I just ran. I left everything behind." "Sometimes running is the bravest thing you can do." His voice was steady, sure. Sometimes staying would be the real cowardice. The tears came without warning, and for the first time since that night she'd stumbled onto his doorstep, Marcus crossed the space between them. He knelt beside her chair and gathered her hands in his touch careful but sure. "Whatever happened," he said quietly, "whatever you had to do to survive, none of it was your fault. Do you understand me?" She wanted to believe him, God, how she wanted to believe that the choices she'd been forced to make didn't define her worth as a person. But the voices from her past were loud, and they'd been telling her she was worthless for so long that his words felt almost too good to be true. As if he could read her thoughts, Marcus reached up and brushed away her tears with his thumb. The gesture was so tender it made her breath catch. "I know it's hard to believe right now," he said, "but I'll keep telling you until you do." That night, as Lily lay in the impossibly comfortable bed Marcus had given her, she pressed her hand to her chest, where that golden warmth had taken up permanent residence. For the first time in 3 years, the future didn't feel like something to be feared. She didn't know that the man downstairs was making phone calls to contacts across 3 states, quietly gathering information about a woman named Lily who had disappeared without a trace months ago. She didn't know that his gentle questions over dinner had been carefully designed to help him piece together exactly what had driven her to his door. And she didn't know that Marcus had already decided that whoever had put those bruises on her throat would answer for it, regardless of what it cost him. All she knew was that for the first time since her world had shattered, she felt something that might have been hope taking root in her chest, and it was growing stronger every day. The message came on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who looked far too serious for comfort. Lily was in the gardens, tending to a patch of herbs that Marcus had shown her the day before. The simple act of nurturing something green and growing had become a meditation for her, a way of proving to herself that she could create instead of merely survive. She had dirt under her fingernails and sunlight in her hair when she heard Marcus's voice from the terrace, sharp with something she'd never heard before: concern, authority, anger. She found him in his study, a formal letter spread across his desk, and his jaw set in a way that made her stomach clench with familiar fear, not fear of him, never of him, but the bone-deep terror that whatever peace she'd found was about to be shattered. "What is it?" she asked, though part of her already knew she didn't want the answer. Marcus looked up at her, and she saw the careful way he arranged his expression, smoothing away whatever darkness had been there moments before. But she'd learned to read him over the past 2 weeks, and she could see the storm brewing in his grey eyes. "There's been a development," he said carefully, "with your legal situation." Her blood went cold. "Legal situation?" "The inheritance your grandmother left you, the one that brought you to—" He paused, seeming to choose his words with unusual care. "The one that put you in danger in the first place." Lily's hands began to shake. She pressed them against her thighs, trying to stop the trembling, but Marcus noticed anyway. He always noticed. "The probate court is demanding your appearance," he continued gently. "If you don't show up within the next 10 days, you'll forfeit any claim to what your grandmother wanted you to have, including the house." "I don't care about the house," she whispered, but even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. That little cottage by the lake had been the only place she'd ever felt truly safe before she'd found Marcus. It was where her grandmother had taught her to bake bread and identify herbs and believe that she was worthy of love. It was also where everything had started to fall apart. "Lily," Marcus's voice was impossibly gentle, "you have to go back." The words hit her like a physical blow. She actually took a step backward, her hand flying to her throat in an instinctive gesture of protection. "No." The word came out strangled, desperate. "No, I can't. Marcus, you don't understand." "Then help me understand." He was on his feet now, moving toward her with that careful grace she'd come to associate with predators who didn't want to spook their prey. "Tell me what you're so afraid of." "I can't go back there," she begged, and she hated how small her voice sounded, how broken. "Please don't make me go back there." Something dangerous flickered in Marcus's expression, a flash of the steel she'd sensed beneath his gentleness. When he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "Tell me who hurt you." The demand hung in the air between them, loaded with a promise of violence that should have terrified her. Instead, it made that golden warmth in her chest flare brighter. He wasn't asking out of idle curiosity. He was asking because he intended to do something about it. "Marcus!" "No." His voice cut through her protest like a blade. "No more deflection. No more changing the subject when things get difficult. I've been patient, Lily. I've given you time and space and asked for nothing in return. But if you expect me to send you back into danger without knowing what I'm sending you into, you're mistaken." The words should have stung. They should have made her feel cornered, trapped. Instead, they made her feel protected, as if his demand for information came not from a desire to control her, but from a desperate need to keep her safe. "His name is Richard Blackwood," she whispered, and saying the name aloud made her feel like she was summoning a demon. He said he was my grandmother's business partner. When she died, he told everyone he was my guardian until I came of age." Marcus's eyes had gone very, very still. "Told everyone?" "The courts, the neighbours, the bank." Her voice was getting smaller with each word, but she couldn't stop now. The dam had cracked and everything was spilling out. "He said my grandmother owed him money, said the house would be his if I couldn't pay the debt." But that wasn't true. It wasn't a question, and Lily found herself shaking her head before she consciously decided to respond. "No, I found the real will hidden in grandmother's recipe box after the funeral. She left everything to me. But Richard had connections, and I was nobody." "You are not nobody." The words came out with such fierce conviction that she actually flinched. Marcus seemed to realise how intense he'd sounded, because he forced his voice gentler. "What did he do to you, Lily?" The question she'd been dreading, the one she'd hoped never to answer. At first it was just control. He moved into the house, said it was to protect me and the property. He controlled the money, the food, who I could see. I wasn't allowed to go to town alone, wasn't allowed to use the phone without him listening. The memories were flooding back now, sharp and clear and nauseating. He said it was for my own good, that I was too naive to understand how the world worked. Marcus's hands had curled into fists, but his voice remained steady. "And then?" "Then I turned 18, and legally the house should have become mine. But he'd already had papers drawn up claiming I was mentally incompetent, said my grandmother had been concerned about my stability before she died." The laugh that escaped her had no humour in it. He had witnesses, people who swore they'd seen me acting erratically, talking to myself, forgetting things. "All lies." "All lies," she confirmed, "but lies that worked, and when I tried to fight it, when I found a lawyer who would listen to me." She touched her throat again, remembering the feeling of his hands there, cutting off her air until spots danced in her vision. Richard made it clear that accidents could happen to girls who didn't know their place. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. When Lily looked up at Marcus, his expression was utterly calm in a way that made every survival instinct she'd developed scream in recognition. This was what apex predators looked like right before they struck. "He put his hands on you." It wasn't a question. "He said I belonged to him now, that my grandmother had promised me to him before she died, and the courts had just made it official." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. "He said if I tried to leave, he'd make sure everyone knew what a disturbed, ungrateful girl I was, that no one would ever believe me over a respected businessman. But you left anyway. I tried to endure it. I thought maybe if I just waited until I turned 21, I could find a way to prove the documents were forged. But then he started." She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't put into words the way he'd looked at her, touched her, made it clear that his intentions went far beyond financial control. "He started what, Lily?" Marcus's voice was deadly quiet. "Coming to my room at night, saying that since I was his ward he had the right to check on my welfare." She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the memory of his hands, his breath on her neck, the way he'd whispered that she should be grateful for his attention. "The night I ran, he told me he'd arranged for us to be married, Said it would make everything legal and proper. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stood perfectly still for a long moment, and Lily found herself holding her breath, waiting for his reaction. Disgust, maybe. Pity. The kind of horrible understanding that would make him look at her like she was broken goods. Instead, when he finally spoke, his voice was filled with a rage so cold and controlled it made her bones ache with relief. Give me his full name, his address, the name of every lawyer he used, every judge he bribed, every witness who lied for him. Each word was precisely enunciated as if he were reading from a list. Give me everything, Lily. Marcus, you can't just... I can. He stepped closer, and she could see gold flecks in his storm-grey eyes that hadn't been there before. Trust me when I tell you that I very much can. There was something in his voice that spoke of resources she couldn't imagine, connections she didn't understand. The way he said it, with such absolute certainty, made her think again of the mysterious phone calls she'd overheard, the deferential way the courier had addressed him, the casual dismissal of an entire household staff. "Who are you?" she whispered. For a moment she thought he might actually answer. Something shifted in his expression, a vulnerability that made him look almost young. But then his phone rang, shattering the moment. "Marcus." His voice was clipped, professional as he answered. The conversation was brief and conducted in a tone she'd never heard from him before, cold, commanding, absolute. When he hung up, his expression had smoothed into something unreadable. "Pack light," he said. "We leave in an hour." "We?" The smile he gave her was sharp enough to cut glass. "Did you really think I would send you back there alone?" Something warm and golden exploded in her chest. Not the gentle warmth she'd grown accustomed to, but something fiercer, more possessive. "You don't have to—" "Yes," he said quietly, "I do." And as she looked into his storm-grey eyes, seeing the promise of protection there, Lily realised that whoever Marcus really was, whatever power he commanded, he had just declared war on her behalf. For the first time since she'd spoken Richard's name aloud, she didn't feel afraid. She felt like she might actually be safe. The private jet waiting on the tarmac was the first sign that Marcus was far more than he'd let her believe. Lily stood at the base of the stairs leading up to the sleek aircraft, her small bag clutched in hands that had started trembling again the moment they left his estate. The jet was pristine white with no visible company markings, but everything about it screamed wealth and power on a scale she'd never imagined. "Marcus," she said quietly, not moving toward the stairs, "what exactly do you do for a living?" He paused beside her, and she caught the slight tightening around his eyes that meant he was choosing his words carefully. "I told you, I handle problems for people who can't handle them themselves. People who own private jets, among other things." His hand found the small of her back, a gentle pressure guiding her toward the plane. "We can discuss it during the flight. Right now we need to get you to that courthouse." The interior of the jet was even more luxurious than she'd expected, all cream leather and polished wood. A flight attendant, who looked like she belonged in a fashion magazine, greeted Marcus by name, not the casual familiarity of someone who saw him occasionally, but the respectful deference of an employee who knew exactly how important he was. "Good afternoon, the woman began, then caught herself with a quick glance at Lily. "Mr. Thorne, we're cleared for immediate departure." "You're what?" Lily found herself wondering, but Marcus had already guided her to one of the wide leather seats and was buckling her seatbelt with the same careful attention. He showed everything that concerned her safety. "I've never been on a plane before," she admitted, as the engines began to rumble to life. Something in his expression softened. "Are you nervous?" "About flying? No." She met his eyes across the narrow aisle between their seats. "About what happens when we land?" "Absolutely." During takeoff, Marcus held her hand. It should have been a simple gesture of comfort, but the moment his fingers laced through hers, that golden warmth in her chest flared so bright it almost took her breath away. Whatever connection existed between them was getting stronger, and she was beginning to suspect it wasn't entirely normal. "Marcus," she said, once they'd reached cruising altitude and the flight attendant had disappeared discreetly toward the front of the cabin. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." He turned in his seat to face her fully, giving her his complete attention in that way that always made her feel like the most important person in the world. "Anything." "Who are you, really?" For a long moment he was quiet. She could see him weighing his words, deciding how much truth to give her. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful. "My full name is Marcus Thorne. I'm the leader of a coalition of sorts. People come to me when they have problems that can't be solved through conventional means." "What kind of problems?" "The kind that require resources most people don't have access to. Influence in places where money alone won't buy results. The ability to make certain that justice is served, even when the system fails." It was an evasive answer, but something in his tone told her it was also true, as far as it went. "And you think you can help me get my grandmother's house back?" "Lily." He leaned forward, his storm-grey eyes holding hers. "I think I can do much more than that." Before she could ask what he meant, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. The name on the screen made her blood freeze. Richard Blackwood. Marcus saw her reaction and was out of his seat instantly, moving to kneel beside her chair. "Don't answer it." "He knows," she whispered, staring at the phone as it continued to buzz. "Somehow he knows I'm coming back." "Answer it," Marcus said suddenly, his voice going hard. "Put it on speaker." "Marcus, I can't. Trust me." His hand covered hers on the phone. "I'm right here. He can't touch you." With trembling fingers, she accepted the call and activated the speaker. "Well, well!" Richard's voice filled the cabin, smooth and cultured and making her skin crawl with remembered fear. "Little Lily finally decides to come home. I was beginning to think you'd forgotten all about your responsibilities here." "What do you want, Richard?" Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "What I've always wanted, darling. For you to stop this foolishness and accept your place. The probate hearing is in 3 days, and I have it on good authority that without your signature on certain documents, you're going to find yourself with nothing but the clothes on your back." "I won't sign anything." Richard's laugh was cold. "Oh, I think you will. You see, I've had time to prepare for your return. The whole town remembers what an unstable girl you were. How you used to talk to yourself, forget things, have those terrible episodes. It would be such a shame if you had another breakdown right there in the courthouse." Marcus's eyes had gone completely cold, but his voice when he leaned toward the phone was perfectly pleasant. "Richard Blackwood, I presume?" The silence that followed stretched for several heartbeats. When Richard spoke again, his voice had lost some of its smooth confidence. "I'm sorry, who is this?" "A friend of Lily's, someone who's very interested in meeting you." "Lily doesn't have friends," Richard said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "Who are you?" Marcus smiled, and Lily felt a chill that had nothing to do with the airplane's air conditioning. "My name is Marcus Thorne. Perhaps you've heard of me." The sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line was audible even through the phone's speaker. Richard's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. That's not possible." "I assure you it is." Marcus's voice was conversational now, almost friendly. "In fact, I'm very much looking forward to discussing Lily's situation with you, face to face." "She belongs to me," Richard said, but his voice had lost all its earlier arrogance. "I have legal guardianship. I have documents." "You have falsified papers and bribed officials," Marcus interrupted calmly. "What you don't have is any legitimate claim to anything that belongs to Lily." "You don't know what you're dealing with. I have connections in that town. Judges, lawyers, law enforcement. No one will believe some outsider over the Alpha King of the Northern Territories." Marcus's voice was still pleasant, but there was steel underneath now. "You're absolutely right, Richard. They probably won't." Lily's world tilted sideways. Alpha King. The phone slipped from her nerveless fingers, but Marcus caught it smoothly, ending the call with a flick of his thumb. When he looked at her, she saw vulnerability in his storm-grey eyes that she'd never noticed before. "You're the Alpha King," she whispered. "Yes." The single word hung in the air between them. Lily felt like she couldn't breathe. The Alpha King, the most powerful shapeshifter in North America. The man whose word was law among dozens of pack territories, whose very name was spoken with reverence and fear. And he'd been cooking her breakfast for 2 weeks. "Oh, God," she breathed. "Oh, God, Marcus, I'm nobody. I'm human. I'm nobody important. I don't even—" "Stop." The command in his voice was absolute, and she found herself obeying before she consciously decided to. "Look at me, Lily." She raised her eyes to his, and what she saw there made her breath catch. Not the terrible power she had expected, but the same gentle man who'd held her while she cried, who'd tended her wounds, who'd promised to keep her safe. "Do you remember what I told you the night we met?" he asked softly. "That you could stay as long as you needed, no questions, no conditions?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Do you remember what I told you yesterday when I said my mother would have loved you?" Another nod. "None of that changes because you know my title now." He reached up to cup her face in his hands, his touch impossibly gentle. "You are not nobody, Lily. You are everything." "But I'm just—" "You're my mate." The words hit her like lightning. She stared at him, seeing the truth in his eyes, feeling that golden thread in her chest pull so tight it almost hurt. "That's impossible," she whispered. "The bond doesn't care about species or status or what anyone else thinks should be possible," he said quietly. "I felt it the moment you stumbled through my gates, that pull, that recognition, that absolute certainty that you were mine and I was yours." "The warmth," she said, understanding flooding through her. "That golden feeling in my chest." "The mate bond," he confirmed. "It's been trying to tell you since the first night." Lily's mind was reeling. Mate bonds were the stuff of shifter legend, the mystical connection that tied 2 souls together across lifetimes. She'd heard stories, of course, everyone had, but she'd never believed they applied to humans. "How?" she managed. "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "I don't care. All I know is that you're mine and I'm yours, and anyone who tries to hurt you will answer to me personally." The plane began its descent, and through the small window Lily could see the familiar landscape of her childhood approaching. The place where Richard Blackwood waited, believing he still had power over her. He had no idea what was coming for him. "Marcus," she said quietly, her hand finding his. "What happens now?" The smile he gave her was sharp and deadly and beautiful. "Now, sweetheart, we go collect what's yours." "And Richard?" Marcus's eyes flashed gold for just a moment. Wolf eyes, she realised, and his voice carried the promise of violence. "Richard is about to learn what happens to men who put their hands on my mate." As the plane touched down, Lily felt that golden warmth in her chest solidify into something stronger than fear, stronger than doubt. She was the mate of the Alpha King, and he had just declared war on anyone who had ever hurt her. For the first time since she'd fled into the night 3 months ago, she felt powerful. She felt protected. She felt like she was coming home. The courthouse steps felt like walking into a battlefield. Lily stood at Marcus's side, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm, trying to draw strength from his steady presence. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps, and she could see faces peering at them from windows and doorways throughout the small town. Word travelled fast in a place like this, and by now everyone would know that Lily Brennan had returned. What they didn't know yet was who she'd brought with her. Marcus cut an imposing figure in his perfectly tailored charcoal suit, every line of his body radiating controlled power. To anyone watching, he looked like exactly what he was, a man accustomed to command, to having his words carry the weight of absolute authority. The way he moved, the way he held himself, even the way other people instinctively stepped out of his path, marked him as someone extraordinary. "You don't have to do this," he murmured as they approached the courthouse doors. "I can handle everything. You can wait in the car." "No." Lily's voice was steadier than she felt. "This is my fight. I need to face him." The approval in Marcus's storm-grey eyes made that golden warmth in her chest flare brighter. "Then we face him together." The courthouse lobby was packed with more people than Lily had ever seen for a probate hearing. Richard's doing, she was sure. He'd always enjoyed an audience for his performances, and humiliating her publicly would be the perfect capstone to years of psychological torture. She spotted him immediately, holding court near the information desk with several men in expensive suits, his lawyers no doubt, and a handful of local officials who'd been in his pocket for years. He looked exactly the same as he had the night she'd fled, silver-haired and distinguished, with the kind of practiced charm that made people trust him instinctively, until they got to know him better. Richard's gaze found hers across the crowded lobby, and his smile was cold and triumphant. He began walking toward them, his legal entourage trailing behind like eager disciples. "Lily," he called out, his voice pitched to carry across the space. "How lovely to see you again, though I have to say, you look—" His eyes travelled over her with the same invasive assessment that had always made her skin crawl. "Well, someone's been taking care of you." Marcus's arm tensed under her hand, but his expression remained perfectly calm. Lily could feel the dangerous energy rolling off him in waves, barely leashed. "Richard," she managed, proud when her voice didn't shake. "And you must be the mysterious Marcus Thorne." Richard's tone was polite, but Lily could hear the underlying mockery. "I have to admit I was surprised to learn of your interest in our little situation here." "Were you?" Marcus's voice was conversational, almost pleasant. "How interesting." Something in his tone made Richard's smile falter slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Yes, well, I'm sure once you understand the full situation, Lily's history of instability, the legitimate concerns about her mental competency, you'll see that the current arrangement is really in everyone's best interest." "Whose best interest would that be?" Marcus asked mildly. "Why, Lily's, of course." Richard's voice dripped with false concern. "The poor girl has always been fragile. Her grandmother worried constantly about her ability to function independently. That's why she asked me to look after Lily, you understand, to make sure she didn't hurt herself or others." The lies rolled off his tongue so smoothly, delivered with such practiced sincerity, that Lily could see several onlookers nodding along. This was what she'd been fighting against for years, Richard's ability to make himself the victim, to paint her as the unstable, ungrateful ward who needed his firm guidance. "That's very touching," Marcus said. "Tell me, Mr. Blackwood, do you have documentation of this conversation with Mrs. Brennan? Written instructions, perhaps?" Richard's smile became strained. It was a private conversation, between friends. Surely you understand that not every arrangement needs to be formalized with lawyers and paperwork. "Actually," Marcus said, his voice taking on an edge that made the hair on Lily's arm stand up, "I find that the most important arrangements are always formalized, with witnesses and very detailed paperwork." From his jacket pocket he produced a thick manila envelope. The rustling of papers being extracted seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet lobby. "For instance," Marcus continued, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the space, "here we have the original will of Margaret Brennan, authenticated by 3 independent handwriting experts. The will that leaves her entire estate, including the house and all financial assets, to her granddaughter Lily, with no conditions and no provisions for any guardian." Richard's face had gone pale. That's not possible. The will was probated years ago." "Yes, the falsified will that you submitted was probated," Marcus agreed pleasantly. "This is the real one. The one Margaret Brennan actually signed, witnessed by her doctor and her pastor, and filed with her attorney in the state capital. The attorney you didn't know she had. A murmur ran through the crowd. Lily felt her knees go weak with relief and shock. Marcus had found it. The proof she'd needed. The evidence that would expose Richard's lies. "That's ridiculous," Richard blustered, but his voice had lost its smooth confidence. "Even if such a document existed, Lily is clearly not competent to manage such an inheritance. The psychological evaluations clearly show—" "Show what exactly?" Marcus's voice cut through Richard's protests like a blade. "Show that a teenage girl exhibited signs of trauma after being isolated, controlled, and systematically abused by the man who was supposed to protect her." The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Lily heard several gasps, saw faces turning toward Richard with new understanding. "How dare you!" Richard snarled, his mask finally slipping. "You have no idea what you're talking about. That girl was nothing when I took her in. Nothing. Worthless, damaged, a burden that no one else wanted to deal with." The moment the words left his mouth, Lily felt the change in Marcus. The temperature in the lobby seemed to drop, and when she looked up at him, his eyes had gone completely cold. "Worthless?" Marcus's voice was deadly quiet, but it carried to every corner of the packed space. "Did you just call my mate worthless?" The word mate hit the crowd like a thunderclap. Lily heard someone gasp, saw a woman's hand fly to her mouth in shock. In shifter culture, claiming someone as a mate wasn't just a declaration of love. It was a sacred bond, recognized by law and tradition. Richard laughed, high and nervous. "Your mate? She's human. She can't be anyone's mate, let alone mine." Marcus stepped forward, and his movement was so predatory that Richard actually took a step back. "Are you questioning the validity of a mate bond, Mr. Blackwood?" "I'm questioning your sanity," Richard snapped. "She's nobody. A mental case with delusions of—" He never finished the sentence. Marcus moved faster than human eyes could follow, his hand closing around Richard's throat and lifting him off his feet. For just a moment, his eyes flashed gold. Wolf eyes, and the power that radiated from him made every person in the lobby take an instinctive step back. "Let me make something very clear," Marcus said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Lily Brennan is under the protection of the Northern Territories Pack. She is my acknowledged mate, which makes her your queen. And you, Mr. Blackwood, have just committed treason." Richard's face was turning purple, his hands clawing uselessly at Marcus's grip. "Please," he gasped. "I didn't know—" "You didn't know because you never bothered to find out who she really was." Marcus's voice was like winter wind. "You saw a young girl with no protector and decided she was prey. You were wrong." He released Richard, who collapsed to the courthouse floor, gasping and clutching his throat. The crowd was dead silent, everyone staring at the scene with the kind of fascinated horror reserved for watching predators hunt. Marcus straightened his tie and smoothed his jacket as if nothing had happened. When he spoke again, his voice was perfectly calm. "The property and all assets will be returned to their rightful owner immediately. Any falsified documents will be surrendered to the authorities. Any officials who participated in this fraud will face investigation." His gaze swept the crowd, lingering on several faces that had gone white with fear. "This is not a request." He turned to the court clerk, who was staring at him with wide eyes. "I trust there won't be any problems processing the legitimate will?" No, sir," the woman stammered. "No problems at all." Marcus extended his arm to Lily, who took it with hands that were steadier than they'd been in years. As they walked toward the courthouse doors, the crowd parted before them like water. But before they could leave, Richard's voice rose from where he still knelt on the floor, desperate and furious. "This isn't over," he called after them. "You think you can just walk in here and—" Marcus stopped, turned. The smile he gave Richard was cold as winter and sharp as broken glass. "Mr. Blackwood," he said pleasantly, "it was over the moment you put your hands on what belongs to me." As they stepped out into the sunlight, Lily felt lighter than she had in years. The golden bond in her chest was singing with happiness, with vindication, with the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. "Is it really over?" she asked quietly. Marcus squeezed her hand. "It's over. You're safe. You're free. And you're mine." "And you're mine," she whispered back, finally understanding what the bond had been trying to tell her all along. Behind them, the courthouse buzzed with excited conversation as the news spread. The Alpha King had claimed a mate, and anyone who threatened her would face the consequences. Richard Blackwood's reign of terror was finished, and Lily Brennan was finally coming home. The weeks that followed were like stepping into a life she'd never dared to dream of. Lily stood in the doorway of her grandmother's cottage, breathing in the scent of lavender and old books that had once meant safety and love. The house looked exactly as it had the day she'd fled. Richard had been too confident in his control to change anything, but everything felt different now. She felt different. Marcus moved through the space behind her, his presence a steady warmth at her back as she reacquainted herself with the rooms that held her happiest memories. His security team had swept the property twice, ensuring that every trace of Richard's occupation was erased, but Marcus himself seemed more interested in watching her face than examining the house. "It's smaller than I remembered," she said softly, running her fingers over the kitchen table where her grandmother had taught her to roll pie crust and identify healing herbs. "It's perfect," Marcus replied, and when she turned to look at him, she saw that familiar tenderness in his storm-grey eyes. "It's you." Over the past month, she'd learned that the Alpha King was nothing like the cold, distant ruler she'd imagined from the stories. Away from the courthouse drama and the weight of his responsibilities, Marcus was gentle and patient, and surprisingly domestic. He'd spent 3 days helping her sort through boxes of her grandmother's belongings, listening with genuine interest as she shared memories connected to faded photographs and handwritten recipes. "She would have loved you," Lily had told him one evening, as they sat on the cottage's front porch, watching the sun set over the lake. "Grandmother always said I'd find someone who saw me for who I really was." "She was a wise woman," Marcus had replied, his arm tightening around her shoulders, "though I think she might have been surprised by the whole Alpha King thing." It was one of the things she loved most about him, his ability to make her laugh, even when discussing the most extraordinary circumstances. The bond between them had settled into something warm and constant, no longer the overwhelming golden rush of recognition, but a steady certainty that felt like coming home. The legal aftermath of Richard's exposure had been swift and merciless. Federal investigators had descended on the small town like avenging angels, unravelling years of corruption and fraud. Richard himself was facing charges that would keep him in prison for the rest of his life, and several local officials had quietly resigned rather than face their own investigations. "You don't have to testify," Marcus had told her when the prosecutors first approached. "I can make sure they have everything they need without putting you through that." But Lily had surprised herself by wanting to face the courtroom one more time, not as a victim, but as a survivor, as someone who refused to let fear make her choices anymore. "I need to do this," she'd said, and Marcus had simply nodded and arranged for the best victim advocates money could buy to help her prepare. Her testimony had been devastating in its quiet precision. She told her story without dramatics or emotional manipulation, simply laying out the facts of 3 years of systematic abuse. The jury had convicted Richard on all counts in less than 2 hours. Now, as Lily explored her reclaimed inheritance, she felt the last pieces of her old fear crumbling away. This house was hers. This life was hers. And the man currently examining her grandmother's collection of herb-drying racks with genuine curiosity was hers too. "Marcus!" she called from the bedroom that had been hers as a child. "Come look at this." She'd found them tucked away in the bottom drawer of her old dresser, letters her grandmother had written but never sent, all addressed to my dearest Lily's true love. The first was dated just months before her grandmother's death. "If you're reading this," Marcus read aloud over her shoulder, "then my granddaughter has found you at last. I always knew she would. She has too much love in her heart to spend her life alone, and too much strength to settle for less than she deserves. Lily felt tears prick her eyes as Marcus continued reading in his deep, steady voice. The letter went on to describe the kind of man her grandmother had hoped Lily would find. Patient, protective, someone who would see her true worth even when she couldn't see it herself. She knew, Lily whispered. Somehow she knew. Grandmothers have a way of knowing things, Marcus said gently, folding the letter carefully and handing it back to her. Mine always said the right person would find me when I needed them most. Is that what happened? You needed me. Marcus turned to face her fully, his hands coming up to frame her face in that gesture that had become as familiar as breathing. Lily, I've been waiting for you my entire life. I just didn't know what I was waiting for until you stumbled through my gates. The kiss that followed was soft and sweet, and full of promises neither of them had been brave enough to make before. When they broke apart, Marcus rested his forehead against hers, and she could see gold flecks dancing in his grey eyes. "Marry me?" he said quietly. It wasn't really a question, but she answered it anyway. "Yes." The ceremony took place 6 weeks later in the garden behind the cottage, surrounded by friends Lily was still getting used to having, and pack members who had welcomed her with a warmth that still amazed her. Marcus's beta, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah who ran his security operations, had become an unexpected ally and friend. His second, a gentle giant named Thomas, had appointed himself Lily's unofficial protector whenever Marcus was handling pack business. But it was the presence of other survivors that meant the most to her. Word had spread through networks she'd never known existed about the Alpha King's mate who had defeated her abuser in court. Women and men who had escaped similar situations reached out, and Lily found herself with a purpose she'd never expected. "I want to help them," she told Marcus one evening as they reviewed another stack of letters from people seeking advice or just someone who would understand. "I want to create something that gives other survivors the resources I never had." "Then we'll create it," Marcus had replied without hesitation. "Whatever you need." The Brennan Foundation had been established within the month, with Marcus's resources and Lily's passion combining to create something that could actually make a difference. They'd purchased a series of safe houses, hired the best counsellors and legal advocates money could buy, and created a network that could help people disappear from dangerous situations and rebuild their lives safely. On their wedding night, as they lay together in the cottage bedroom that now belonged to both of them, Lily traced patterns on Marcus's chest and marvelled at the turns her life had taken. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Everything you gave up to be with me?" Marcus caught her hand and pressed it flat against his heart, where she could feel the steady rhythm that had become her favourite sound. "What exactly do you think I gave up?" "You're the Alpha King. You could have had anyone. Someone from a powerful pack family, someone who could bring political advantages, someone who actually knows how to be a queen." "Lily." His voice was patient but firm. "Look at me." She lifted her head to meet his gaze, and what she saw there made her breath catch. Love, yes, but also something deeper. Complete certainty. "I don't want someone who knows how to be a queen," he said quietly. "I want someone who knows how to be kind, someone who sees a stranger bleeding on her doorstep and offers help without question, someone who uses her own pain to heal others instead of letting it make her bitter." "Marcus." "Someone," he continued, brushing her hair back from her face, "who is brave enough to stand up to a courtroom full of people and tell her truth, even when she's terrified. Someone who can make me laugh during pack meetings and remind me that power without compassion is just cruelty, dressed up in fancy titles." Tears were sliding down her cheeks, but they were good tears, happy tears. "You didn't give anything up for me, sweetheart," Marcus whispered against her lips. "You gave me everything I never knew I needed." As they kissed under the soft light of the bedside lamp, Lily felt the last pieces of her old life fall away completely. She was no longer the broken girl who had fled into the night, no longer the victim who believed she deserved the pain that had been inflicted on her. She was Lily Brennan Thorne, mate to the Alpha King, survivor turned advocate, and the woman who had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is choose to trust again. Outside their window, the lake reflected the stars, and somewhere in the distance wolves howled in celebration of their alpha's happiness. It was the sound of a pack welcoming its new queen, of a community that had gained not just a leader but a healer. And in the cottage where her grandmother had once promised that love would find her, Lily finally understood what home really meant. Where are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. I love hearing your thoughts on these stories, and if you'd like to support me, please subscribe. It's free, and it helps more people hear these stories about finding love, healing from trauma, and discovering that sometimes the most broken people create the most beautiful families.